So tonight, we come to the 11th chapter in the Life Divine. Delight of existence, the problem. And he opens with mottos, as he calls them, citations from the Taittiriya Upanishad, which we're somewhat familiar with, but let's go through them. They are themselves a delight to read. For who could live or breathe if there were not this delight of existence as the ether in which we dwell? From delight, all these beings are born. By delight they exist and grow. To delight they return. The Taittiriya Upanishad is one of the older prose Upanishads. Sri Aurobindo had the intention to give a strong treatment to the Taittiriya in the same way that he gave an extended analysis of the Isha Upanishad and the Kena Upanishad. But simply he didn't have time. But the Taittiriya, because it deals so much and so often with the idea that all stems from an originating Ananda, was kin to his philosophy, his perspective, in a way that other Upanishads were not. But he had to satisfy himself with an occasional reference to this Upanishad in the pages of the Life Divine. But there is an early translation of the Taittiriya, which he did before he came to Pondicherry, which you can read for free in any of the Upanishads that you have available to you, either from the SABCL edition or from the new edition. And you can get it for free online, of course. We've spoken about that last citation. From delight all these beings are born, but delight they exist and grow, to delight they return. That's part of that old saga when Varanu's son Bhrigu comes and asks his father for the truth of existence. What is the nature of reality? And rather than simply tell him, he sends that young man off to do tapasya, to go inside, to concentrate, and see if he can find out what the answer of existence is. And you remember, from the first discovery, that this plenary world, this extended physical universe, which is food, is the ground of all things. He moves to the idea that it is life, which originates all, and discovers that mind is beyond life, and that this vast intelligence, which Sri Aurobindo would later name the supermind, the Vijnana, that exceeded even the realm of mind. So story after story of this laddering plane of existence, he climbs greater roof to greater roof, and finally is led to discover that it is delight that is the origin of all things. By delight they come into being, by delight they're sustained, and to delight they pass and they're going hence. So that is the original urge to creation. This universe is not a material or a vital or a mental or even a supramental creation. It comes from this oceanic bliss, which is the very nature of Brahman. So this first paragraph is in itself an admirable summation of where we've been in recent chapters, from the pure existent Sat, from the conscious force, Chit or Chik Shakti, and now we're into the principle of Ananda. So he opens this chapter. But even if we accept this pure existence, this Brahman, this Sat as the absolute beginning, end, and continent of things, and in Brahman, an inherent self-consciousness, inseparable from its being, and throwing itself out as a force of movement of consciousness, which is creative of forces, forms, and worlds, we have yet no answer to the question, why should Brahman, perfect, absolute, infinite, needing nothing, desiring nothing, at all throw out force of consciousness to create in itself these worlds of form? To create in itself these worlds of forms, pardon me. So here he is looking for the motive of manifestation. Why should this absoluteness throw itself out? Now, let's pause. Sri Aurobindo has used 3 adjectives in succession. Perfect, absolute, infinite, in application to the nature of being. These all have Latin derivations. Perfect, from perfectio, which means that which is complete. Absolute, which means perfect or perfectly completed, from absolutus. And infinite, obviously, negativing the finite, which is circumscribed in its nature. So the infinite is that which is unbounded, unlimited. When we first meet the term infinite, it has a suggestion that it's in reference to numbers, because numbers always succeed one another, and you can count and count and count. You never come to the end of it. But Sri Aurobindo's reference is not to numerical infinitude. When you apply it to being, it refers to that which has no boundary, which is unlimited, which is ungraspable because it is so far out. Even the terms everywhere and anywhere have no locus for that. So this perfect, absolute, infinite being, which has no need of anything because it is by definition complete in itself and has all within it, all force, all delight already present, why would it bother to move? Why move? So he's going to explore first what might be the motivation for what is the manifestation. For we have put aside the solution that it is compelled by its own nature of force to create, obliged by its own potentiality of movement and formation to move into forms. It, this infinite being, is not forced to manifest against its will. It is impossible for a force to arise within it to compel it, which is infinite, to do that which is against its own nature and its own volition. There is no other self to overcome it. You get that, right? And this potentiality that it has, well, let's go on to the next sentence. It is true that it has this potentiality, but it is not limited, bound, or compelled by it. It is free. If then, being free to move or remain eternally still, to throw itself into forms or retain the potentiality of form in itself, it indulges its power of movement and formation, it can be only for one reason, for delight. You remember back in the chapter on the pure existence, Sri Aurobindo wrote this wonderful sentence. World existence is the ecstatic dance of Shiva, which multiplies the body of the god numberlessly to the view. It leaves that white existence precisely where and what it was, ever is, and ever will be. Its sole absolute object is the joy of the dancing. It can only be for one reason, for delight, that this infinite decides to manifest a universe which to us seems vast, but which to it is necessarily, by definition, finite. Why has the infinite become finite? Because it wants to play, to enjoy. So he continues, this primary, ultimate, and eternal existence, as seen by the Vedantins, is not merely bare existence or a conscious existence whose consciousness is crude force or power. It is a conscious existence, the very term of whose being, the very term of whose consciousness is bliss. Again, you're going to get tired of me pausing as we go, but he's referred here to an eternal existence as seen by the Vedantins. And let's recall that this idea of an existence which is conscious and whose nature is delight, Satchit Ananda, as we'll see again in just a moment, is not something that we have met in the Upanishads. It is not a concept that comes from the Upanishads. It also does not come from the Brahma Sutras, a second source of the Vedanta. We do not find it really in the Bhagavad Gita. We do not find it in Shankara's Advaita Vedanta either. We begin to meet this term in what we could call theistic Vedanta, probably first in the Nrsimha Uttara Tapaniya Upanishad. We see it referred to in a text in which Sridhara quotes Vishnu Swamin in reference to Satchit Ananda Ishvara, that the nature of the Supreme Lord is existence, consciousness, bliss. So it is, in its very beginning, a concept which leans on the existent, not on sheer existence. This is not like a homogenized, absolute existence, void of personality, but Satchit Ananda is the play of a supreme person. It is the nature of this supreme person. We find this later in Vallabhacharya, who developed a pure monism, different from Shankara's, in which Satchidananda may be its nature, but it is not a nature which is built upon a movement of Maya which is an illusion or a cheat, but rather that it is a wave of joy that creates, and it is never lost from its own self-knowledge. And to farther pursue that would take us beyond the scope of Sri Aurobindo. So I just wanted to set for a moment the context in which this idea of Satchidananda occurs. So we're looking at a concept that is perhaps 1,000 years old, maybe slightly older, and an idea that begins to dominate Indian thought or Vedantic thinking only from around the 14th or 15th century. So it's relatively recent by comparison to the Upanishads. But this notion of Satchit Ananda is absolutely central to Sri Aurobindo's philosophy. So, he's established that this conscious existence has a nature of delight. Consciousness is bliss, he has written. So let's return to Sri Aurobindo. The next sentence. As in absolute existence, there can be no nothingness, no night of inconscience, no deficiency, that is to say, no failure of force, for if there were any of these things, it would not be absolute. So also there can be no suffering, no negation of delight. So this is an unbroken blanket of being. If we took a physical image of a blanket and there were holes in it, some nothingness that was there, then that blanket would not be absolute. But we have said this being is absolute and extended boundlessly. There is no direction to go in because only that exists. There is no night of inconscience because this is all light. This is fully aware of itself. There can be no deficiency because its power is absolute. It's contained in absolute being. There can be no failure of force, as he writes. And just so, because Ananda is its nature, there can be no diminution of that experience. There can be no negation of delight. It is impossible for suffering to exist where all is bliss. So, he then continues, absoluteness of conscious existence is illimitable bliss of conscious existence. The two are only different phrases for the same thing. All illimitableness, all infinity, all absoluteness is pure delight. Even our relative humanity has this experience that all dissatisfaction means a limit, an obstacle. Satisfaction comes by realization of something withheld, by the surpassing of the limit, the overcoming of the obstacle. We'll see that this is key to understanding the nature of this dilemma. So when something is withheld from us and we strive to get it, then we have satisfaction because we attain our goal. But the fact that we had to strive to get it meant that we were delimited in some way. We were no longer infinite. Something existed outside us, or seemed to, that we had to reach out to grasp. And only in the attainment of that do we gain satisfaction, is our fullness experience. This might also remind you of a passage, I think it's in the Chandogya Upanishad, where it's described, the small is unhappy, the large is happy. When you're small and constricted in your being, when you live inside your little ego, you suffer. The world's against you, it seems to be. But when you let that go, and the walls come down, and you expand, and embrace the world, and become large, then there is happiness. One moves from unhappiness into happiness. So, growth is the avenue that takes us to bliss. Sri Aurobindo writes, this is because our original being is the Absolute, in full possession of its infinite and illimitable self-consciousness and self-power, a self-possession whose other name is self-delight, and in proportion as the relative touches upon that self-possession, it moves towards satisfaction, touches delight. So, if infinite being means that there is infinite experience of Ananda. Then if the relative exceeds itself and touches that absolute, then it's moving towards that originating delight. So obviously, the suggestion is, if we're not happy with our current experience of the world, then we must become one with that which originates the world. And that original being is not simply being, it is consciousness, it is delight, and however you move those three terms around, you come to the same thing, because it is only one. So, the self-delight of Brahman is not limited, however, by the still and motionless possession of its absolute self-being. Just as its force of consciousness is capable of throwing itself into forms infinitely and with an endless variation, so also its self-delight is capable of movement, of variation, of reveling in that infinite flux and mutability of itself represented by numberless teeming universes. So first, that Brahman, complete in itself, might be still, but it is not limited to that. Its consciousness implies force of being, remember? Chit Shakti. So it can move and it can manifest and support and sustain an infinite number of expressions of itself, whether they're individuals or whether they're universes. And it does not detract from its being. Being truly infinite, numberless, measureless universes do not equate to that. It still can give and give more. And it gives, as he suggests here, by implication, through a movement of consciousness and a movement of delight, because they are the same thing. The consciousness seeds this, delight unrolls it. Light and bliss, both together, are creative of this and any other universe. To loose forth and enjoy this infinite movement and variation of its self-delight is the object of its extensive or creative play of force. So Sri Aurobindo concludes this paragraph, but it's the third time he's essentially said this, right? We've gone back to the pure existence. World existence, Shiva multiplying himself endlessly to the view. That auspicious being does it simply for the joy of the dancing. A paragraph or two ago, he said the same thing, and he says now, if Sri Aurobindo is going to say something 3 times in 20 pages, he means it. This is the nature of his experience. He comes back to it again and again. This is bedrock for him. He continues, in other words, that which has thrown itself out into forms is a triune existence, consciousness, bliss, Sat Chit Ananda, whose consciousness is in its nature a creative, or rather a self-expressive force, capable of infinite variation in phenomenon and form of its self-conscious being, and endlessly enjoying the delight of that variation. It follows that all things that exist are what they are as terms of that existence, terms of that conscious force, terms of that delight of being, because there is nothing outside it. only that exists. So if we see a multiple universe, every single thing in it is an expression, a deliberate, consciously seated, S-E-E-D-E-D, expression of that one being. Just as we find all things to be mutable forms of one immutable being, he writes, finite results of one infinite force, so we shall find that all things are variable self-expression of one invariable and all-embracing delight of self-existence. In everything that is dwells the conscious force, and it exists and is what it is by virtue of that conscious force. So also in everything that is, there is the delight of existence, and it exists and is what it is by virtue of that delight. So whatever you see is born of conscious being. Whatever you see is born of conscious delight. Being exists in delight. Being exists in consciousness. Consciousness exists in being. Consciousness exists in delight. And inescapably, when we get to the fundamental spiritual experience of reality, we see that all is one. You can't express what that is. Sri Aurobindo says, we call it Satchit Ananda. But what it is escapes our human language to describe. The way you validate it for yourself is to have the experience of it. Being, consciousness, Ananda, are ever present and one. This ancient Vedantic theory of cosmic origin, here's the root of the cosmos, is immediately confronted in the human mind by two powerful contradictions: the emotional and sensational consciousness of pain and the ethical problem of evil. Pain and evil. For if the world be an expression of Satchit Ananda, not only of existence that is conscious force, for that can easily be admitted, but of existence that is also infinite self-delight, how are we to account for the universal presence of grief, of suffering, of pain? And we come to the idea of theodicy. Theodicy, theos, God, dike, justice, the roots in Latin. The term really brought into modern philosophy by Leibniz, who wanted to argue that the justice of God in building a world of evil is the constitution of the best of all possible worlds, of which this is, he says. So when we deal with this problem of evil, and this problem of pain and suffering, in philosophy in theology we call it theodicy. We have to see why in this infinite ocean of being, when it comes into manifestation, should there be this experience of pain? Why can the experience of suffering arise? So, the rest of this chapter, what we do tonight and what we do next week, will all be dealing with this. So, we'll move forward a little at a time. So, continuing, for this world appears to us rather as a world of suffering than as a world of the delight of existence. And he chooses the term appears. Certainly, that view of the world is an exaggeration, an error of perspective. So he's suggesting that this world may seem to be a world of suffering, but it is not. It's a misinterpretation. If we regard it dispassionately, he writes, and with a sole view to accurate and unemotional appreciation, we shall find that the sum of the pleasure of existence far exceeds the sum of the pain of existence. Appearances and individual cases to the contrary notwithstanding, and that the active or passive, surface or underlying pleasure of existence is the normal state of nature. Pain, a contrary occurrence, temporarily suspending or overlaying that normal state. So pain and suffering is a departure from the normative experience of existence. We don't notice it. What is the basic delight or pleasure in simply being is something we do not attend to. We just presume it. So what varies from that, above or below, becomes the object of our attention. He continues, but for that very reason, the lesser sum of pain affects us more intensely and often looms larger than the greater sum of pleasure. Precisely because the latter is normal, we do not treasure it, hardly even observe it, unless it intensifies into some acuter form of itself, into a wave of happiness, a crest of joy or ecstasy. It is these things that we call delight and seek. And the normal satisfaction of existence, which is always there, regardless of event and particular cause or object, affects us as something neutral, which is neither pleasure nor pain. It is there, a great practical fact, for without it there would not be the universal and overpowering instinct of self-preservation. But it is not what we seek, and therefore we do not enter it into our balance of emotional and sensational profit and loss. In other words, we would fly away from existence ex post haste if suffering were its very nature. The moment pain and suffering end, we don't remember it. We're back where we were in the modicum of delight which we experience with our relative consciousness. To experience more deeply, we have to become deeper. So we seek intense forms of delight. And again, this reminds us of that allusion that the Chandogya Upanishad makes to largeness of being. In that balance, Sri Aurobindo writes, we enter only positive pleasures on one side and discomfort and pain on the other. Pain affects us more intensely because it is abnormal to our being, contrary to our natural tendency, and is experienced as an outrage on our existence, an offense, an external attack on what we are and seek to be. To experience any diminution of our ultimate self feels like an affront. It is offensive to our nature. But we have to find out why we live in a state of relativity, where we relate to other beings, other objects, why we experience a limitation of being. This we have to get to the root of this. We aren't there yet. The context is being laid. And he continues, nevertheless, the abnormality of pain or its greater or lesser sum does not affect the philosophical issue. Greater or less, its mere presence constitutes the whole problem. In other words, he's not trying to scotch the issue. He's not trying to escape the issue by saying, on the whole, there's more pleasure than pain in the world. Nevertheless, why is there pain and suffering at all? He's going to deal with it. All being Satchit Ananda, we have established that. How can pain and suffering at all exist? This, the real problem, is often farther confused by a false issue starting from the idea of a personal, extracosmic God, and a partial issue, the ethical difficulty. So let's deal with those. And here we're going to get into religion a bit. I hope none of you will be offended. Satchit Ananda, it may be reasoned, is God, is a conscious being who is the author of existence. How then can God have created a world in which he inflicts suffering on his creatures, sanctions pain, permits evil? So this is a question of creation. Why would God create such a world? Well, we've seen that Sri Aurobindo's notion of Satchit Ananda is of an infinite existence, an infinite consciousness, an infinite delight, which is full of power. It is regnant. It rules. It can do what it wishes. Why would it do this? Why create a world in which this experience of pain and suffering can exist? Is this a God? He writes, if we say that pain is a trial and an ordeal, we do not solve the moral problem. We arrive at an immoral or non-moral God, an excellent world mechanist perhaps, a cunning psychologist, but not a God of good and of love whom we can worship, only a God of might, to whose law we must submit, or whose caprice we may hope to propitiate. If God is all good, why does he create what is bad, or allow it to come into being? If he's all powerful, why would it come into being? And if we experience because we're being tested, and we're being trained to exceed ourselves, why would he do that? Why would he create us in such a limited way that we'd have to go through that ordeal? So, if that's true, then he's immoral, or at least non-moral. And he may have built a wonderful machine, but this device by which he goads us forward to grow psychologically is, well, he's a rather perverse psychologist to entice us in that way, The carrot and the stick, well, maybe mostly the stick. For one who invents torture as a means of test or ordeal stands convicted either of deliberate cruelty or of moral insensibility. And if a moral being at all is inferior to the highest instinct of his own creatures, because we can at least conceive that you could do better. And comics make a living to this day saying, we can show you how to make a better world. By the way, we've moved from the question of creation now to, wait, a little bit farther. And if to escape this moral difficulty, we say that pain is an inevitable result and natural punishment of moral evil, an explanation which will not even square with the facts of life unless we admit the theory of karma and rebirth, by which the soul suffers now for antenatal sins in other bodies, we still do not escape the very root of the ethical problem. Who created, or why, or whence was created that moral evil which entails the punishment of pain and suffering? So even if you put it behind us, oh, you're getting punished for what you did in the past and you just don't remember, well, what kind of world is that? That's still, you haven't evaded it at all. The argument is still there. So he's quite right to draw our attention to this. And seeing, I think now is the point at which we say we began this paragraph. Let's see if I can complete a sentence tonight. We began this paragraph with the question of creation, and now we're to the question of punishment. Shall we proceed? And seeing that moral evil is in reality a form of mental disease or ignorance. Who or what created this law or inevitable connection which punishes a mental disease or act of ignorance by a recoil so terrible, by tortures often so extreme and monstrous? This is interesting, isn't it? Moral evil is not evil absolute. Moral evil is a result either of uncoordinated physical and vital and mental machinery, or it's simply ignorance. We don't know better because our knowledge is restricted. So if either of those is the author of a bad act, then why fall upon that person's head with unreasonable force? Sri Aurobindo is writing, as you know, 1915, 100 years ago. We still apply such punishment through our courts of law. He continues, the inexorable law of karma is irreconcilable with the supreme moral and personal deity, and therefore the clear logic of Buddha denied the existence of any free and all-governing personal God. All personality he declared to be a creation of ignorance and subject to karma. Well, that's a fitting conclusion if you accept the thesis that an extra-cosmic God has created this world. This is not Sri Aurobindo's position. Again, this is an argument, which is a compelling argument. This is not Sri Aurobindo's view. Continuing, the next paragraph. In truth, the difficulty thus sharply presented arises only if we assume the existence of an extra-cosmic personal God, not himself the universe, one who has created good and evil, pain and suffering for his creatures, but himself stands above and unaffected by them, watching, ruling, doing his will with a suffering and struggling world, or, if not doing his will, if allowing the world to be driven by an inexorable law, unhelped by him, or inefficiently helped, then not God, not omnipotent, not all good and all loving. Let's start with the simple part. Extra-cosmic means outside the universe. This is a God who creates a world but does not exist within it. This is the typical perspective of theistic religion. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam posit that God is above and beyond this world, transcendent to this world, creates the world, but does not dwell in it, does not participate in it, remains aloof. Otherwise, his absolutely perfect being would be tarnished by connection to the relative and the imperfect. So, that personal God can say, this is how I want you to live, and if you don't live, I shall smite you when you err. And has apparently, since both good and evil operate upon this world, created both good and evil, and yet blames people if they can't overcome the evil and be only good, even though he himself must have put it here. In the meantime, he's above in the Empyrean, enjoying, rolling in his delight, in his absolute light, and unconcerned apparently about dipping his hand down into that waste of a cosmos to fish a few out, unless they do his bidding and live just as he says. So clearly, since Sri Aurobindo is writing so amusingly about this, this is not his view of what either this manifestation is or what the divine being is, whoever that might be. He continues, on no theory of an extra-cosmic moral God can evil and suffering be explained. The creation of evil and suffering except by an unsatisfactory subterfuge which avoids the question at issue instead of answering it, or a plain or implied Manichaeanism which practically annuls the Godhead in attempting to justify its ways or excuse its works. Are you familiar with Manichaeanism? It's Mani was a Babylonian who lived, let's say, in the 3rd century CE, who, in his theology, opposed good and evil, God and Satan, light and dark. Pitted against each other in this world, they wrestle in an unceasing antinomy. And now one is winning, and now the other is winning. And only when you reach the final stage of the life of the universe will one side or the other win. And of course, light will finally win, but in the meantime, evil gives as good as he gets, if I can put it that way. And the idea that evil cannot instantaneously overcome evil is a root problem with this philosophy, but this is a dualism that strongly influenced and colored the development of Christianity. This idea of the battle between the forces of dark and light. The forces of dark and light are present in all religions and all philosophies. They account for them in different ways, but to posit them as almost covalent forces is unique to Manichaeanism. So let's read that part again. Or a plain or implied Manichaeanism which practically annuls the Godhead in attempting to justify its ways or excuse its work. Because maybe good and light are just not strong enough to overcome that. But ultimately, obviously, even darkness had to come from the originating Godhead. So somehow, this God made darkness and then couldn't overcome it. Wasn't strong enough to defeat it. But such a God is not the Vedantic Satchit Ananda. Satchit Ananda of the Vedanta is one existence without a second. Remember, Sri Aurobindo has cited before at the top of a paragraph, the pure existent. Paragraph, the top of a chapter, the pure existent. Asid ekam eva dityam. The one existent without a second. all that is he. If then, suffering, where's my water? If then evil and suffering exist, it is he that bears the evil and suffering in the creature in whom he has embodied himself. The problem then changes entirely. There is only one being. If there is limitation of being, if there's the finite, if there's the appearance of ignorance, if there's error, if there's pain, if there's evil, if there's suffering, it can only be because he is there to receive and bear it. He's the one that takes the blow, really. Again, the problem then changes entirely. The question is no longer, how came God to create for his creatures a suffering and evil of which he is himself incapable and therefore immune? But how came the soul and infinite existence, consciousness, bliss, to admit into itself that which is not bliss, that which seems to be its positive negation? So this is a different question. This is the real question that we have to answer. Half of the moral difficulty, he writes, that difficulty in its one unanswerable form disappears. It no longer arises, can no longer be put. Cruelty to others, I remaining immune or even participating in their sufferings by subsequent repentance or belated pity, is one thing. Self-infliction of suffering, I being the sole existence, is quite another. Still, the ethical difficulty may be brought back in a modified form. All delight being necessarily all good and all love, how can evil and suffering exist in Satchidananda, since he is not mechanical existence, but free and conscious being, free to condemn and reject evil and suffering? So it's back in this face, in this form. We have to recognize that the issue so stated is also a false issue because it applies the terms of a partial statement as if they were applicable to the whole. For the ideas of good and of love, which we thus bring into the concept of the all delight, spring from a dualistic and divisional conception of things. They are based entirely on the relations between creature and creature, yet we persist in applying them to a problem which starts, on the contrary, from the assumption of one who is all. In other words, this all arises when we attend only to the divisibility, the apparent divisibility of the phenomena of nature, and seize upon that, and then try to explain oneness in terms of what seems to be divisibility. We're off by a category. We have confused categories of being. We have to see first, he writes, how the problem appears, or how it can be solved in its original purity on the basis of unity and difference. Only then can we safely deal with its parts and its developments, such as the relations between creature and creature, on the basis of division and duality. So in other words, we have to contextualize. We can't judge from the point of view of the many until we have placed it within the context of oneness. So, if you're still with us, we began the chapter with a need to understand that the motivation for the manifestation of the world is delight. And that delight is an absoluteness of conscious being, which means that it is fully capable, absolutely capable, of expressing itself fully in terms of delight. Dissatisfaction implies a limit in being, but in Satchit Ananda there is no limitation. It is the ground of all being, and so if subsequently we look at the world, we must recognize that Satchit Ananda dwells within it. It dwells within Satchit Ananda. Existence is consciousness, is bliss, and it is everywhere. Pain and evil, if they arise, and they do arise, is a departure from our normative experience of the world. But even so, we have to answer how it comes to exist anyway. We have to rule out that there's an extra-cosmic God. With Buddha, we agree about that. There can be no God that stands apart from the universe and rules it. But there is experienceable to us, and which we can posit through philosophy, through sound reasoning, one existence without a second. And self-suffering has to be contextualized for us to understand why Satchidananda would permit it. So that's the point we've reached tonight. We're going to put our bookmarks there, and we'll continue with the description of the problem of the delight of existence next time. So, if you have any brief questions, I know I've kept you for a while tonight, but if you have a brief question, I'll be happy to entertain it. You don't want to entertain me with a question. Very well, I see.
Very clear.
Okay. Then I'm delighted to release you to meditation. Namaste.
Namaste.
More soon. Ah, yes. Namaste.